Welcome to the Wanstead Tap. Are you all regulars? I know. What's the furthest anyone's come this evening?
Boston.
Where?
Boston.
That's quite a long way.
It's a bit worth it.
Is it Boston and Lincolnshire?
No, it's not the one.
That'd still be a long way. So.
That is a long way, but it's even longer.
You come from Boston for this event tonight?
Yes.
Ian, they're your super fans over there. That's unbelievable.
It's just disgusting.
That's serious.
Yes, that's the John Roger.
That's almost worrying.
It is. I'm restraining myself, John. Restraining myself. But yes, I'm a groupie.
This is a big moment for all of us, I think.
It is.
I just realised I'm not recording. I was going to record. It's very amateurish of me. I document everything, so just for the sake of my document, I just said some things that went down really well. It was really funny. Somebody called me a genius in the back of the room, and someone come from Boston to see me. Do it again. Right, yeah, very good. Yeah, sorry, get on with it. Fair enough. No, too So actually, I will go on with it. So this evening we're going to have a bit of chat with Ian about his new book. Iain Sinclair, sorry, Ian, just all being very familiar, aren't we? It's because people are coming from Boston. With Iain Sinclair, the wonderful writer Iain Sinclair, to talk about his new book, Living with Buildings, Walking with Ghosts. That's where you cheer. And which is really exciting moment. It's an incredible book. So does Ian need to be introduced? Really, who doesn't know who Iain Sinclair is? Who got dragged along here with a friend? Who's that bloke who keeps wasting time? I don't know. Ian is, it's going to be awkward for me if I blow too much smoke up his arse, because then I have to sit here for the rest of the evening. But Ian is the godfather of London writing, contemporary London writing. He's been chronicling the city now, since the late 60s. I was telling someone the other day about your Allen Ginsberg story, which is amazing. And from that to this, and this book is a bit different to some of Ian's previous works. In some ways it's not. How many books have you written and published now, Ian? Do you know?
I'd have to ask Jeff Johnson.
It's in the hundreds, according to Jeff, or thousands, isn't it?
No.
It's 70 books, 70 publications over a period of, I don't want to put a number on it, but it's getting 50 years now, isn't it?
About that.
Nearly 50 years, which is incredible. And so we're absolutely honoured to have Ian at the Wanstead Tap, so please welcome Iain Sinclair.
You. I'm just going to warn you, if I let out a sudden scream or yelp, it's not because of the question, it's because I've carried too many books around yesterday and talked too much. I was doing a first day of teaching in Guildford, and in the middle of it, after I'd been talking for an hour, suddenly I got this excruciating pain in the back, which is still there, but being with John, being here, is kind of putting it out of my head. But if I suddenly move in a weird way and let out a scream, I'm just letting you know. It's also known as performance art.
And of course, like performance art, the mic stands are in a really weird position, aren't they? This is going to be like, this can all go horribly wrong when you start doing this. So, Ian, I think we have to do I think we're obliged, because no one's read the book.
No.
Not even the superfans from Boston, which is, I think,
We couldn't get it to
yeah.
Well, what I also should have said was that the book is supposedly about walking and health. So I was calling up all the devils, by writing this book. To put it into context, it's one of the, I think, in all these books that John mentioned, this might be the only one that's ever been commissioned in advance. Normally I have to kind of make a hard sell pitch, and these days you have to pretty much write the whole thing before anyone gives you a halfpenny. But the Welcome Collection on Euston Road were doing an exhibition which is now open called Living with Buildings. And the theory of the exhibition was, it's very obvious, that good building creates good health, and they went through the examples right back through the Dickensian period in London to right through to the recent tragedies, and they wanted a kind of book in parallel that would not be the book of their exhibition, since I didn't know what the exhibition was, and it would be free form in my style, but it would touch on some of the same themes. So this sounded like a good deal, until I actually did it free form, and they said, yes, we don't quite know what you're talking about whalebone boxes for. So one of the things, I went into a kind of shamanic thing about a whalebone box made by a sculptor, Steve Dilworth, up in the Hebrides in the 1990s when we were filming him. He's going to bury this box in Rodal Church, and halfway through burying it, he's dug it all up and everything. He said, wait a minute, there's people filming me. And I said, well, yes, we are making a documentary film, so there's probably no way around that. And he said, well, no, that can't happen. Take it away and bring it back when the time is right. So I took this box back to London, and it sat on my desk like a battery all through the years of these books I'd written. Until just recently, Steve's wife was taken quite ill, and I thought, this is the moment it has to go back. So that the healing pilgrimage of carrying this thing back up to the Hebrides in the middle of the winter through snow and all the rest of it became a kind of a theme in the book, as well as talking about estates like the Pepys estate, which we'll be seeing, where John was filming down in Deptford, and Le Corbusier estate in Marseille. All of those things came into it, but really the human story was more dynamic for me. And I realized quite soon that I didn't want to call the book Living with Buildings at all. So I put in a subtitle, And Walking with Ghosts. And then I realized what I really wanted to call it was Living with Ghosts and Walking with Buildings. So that made much more sense. That was my life. And the thesis was that you keep moving. As long as you keep moving, the disease won't catch up with you. So the way you treat hospitals is to walk around the outside of them. Don't go in. It's full of sick people, you'll catch something. And the more modern and the cleaner and the better looking the building, particularly the Wellcome Collection on Euston Road, the more likely you are to feel your energies draining in about 25 seconds. There's a kind of generic building that's like an airport departure lounge, which could be a university, could be a hospital, could be a collection of some kind. They have those bright, hard chairs. They have complimentary coffee that you pay for. And monitor screens that are showing silent disasters from everywhere else to make you feel good you're out of it. And the street is at a distance, and there are security guards and all of those things. So that was the kind of world I got into with this book. And what became quite moving was that I got deeply engaged with the stories of a bunch of people who were seriously involved in the psychology of buildings. And the key building, I suppose, where I had to start was Christchurch Spitalfields, which I've been writing about for many, many years. And at the start of my career when I was a gardener, I was looking at these Hawksmoor churches and wondering about the interrelation between them. That gave me a sense of a pattern in London, of a series of designs which sometimes seem to be occult or seem to be political or whatever. And so to return to that building now and look at it through the eyes of the painter Leon Kossoff, who grew up nearby and is now pretty old, and who's documented this building in a beautiful, heavy, energetic, energized, almost expressionist way. And the photographs of Jack London in his book People of the Abyss, which was beautifully republished recently. And you see that Jack London is interested in the vagrant populations of London as they spread around the building, but he doesn't go into the building and he doesn't look up at the building. And a painter called Rebecca Hind in 2011, or 2010, sorry, was commissioned to do a triptych reredos painting for the building. And this was very interesting because it was all about flow. It's there now, you can check it out. Flow and light, and it was like opening up the back of this monumental building, which was like a huge piece of sculpture, and challenging the dominant male energies. Such a dominating masculine presence, and the figures who are represented in the church are mostly male. So Rebecca's paintings were like flow or music even, and I looked at that, and I looked at it in conjunction with an American, not from Boston but from Sag Harbor on Long Island, a woman who I'd known in London whose father was an architect. And when I was writing this original stuff about Hawksmoor's buildings, she found it so malignant, she thought the only answer was to bury it and to kind of create an earthwork, a huge earthwork, with maybe the top of the steeple would stick out. So taking those kind of strange ideas, magic, shamanism and everything else in relation to health is a mystery. And I follow those journeys through the book. And in the course of looking for the whalebone box and things about whales, I went to see Philip Hoare, who's a great whale scholar and lover down in Southampton, and that led into contemplation of Netley, the huge military asylum right on the water in Southampton, which is now basically a ruin, but which had a very interesting history, including Jonathan Miller making his Alice in Wonderland there. So there are all kinds of unexpected journeys. It's a book of journeys, it's a book of starts, and in the end it's also a book of deaths, because a lot of the people I've been pursuing at the end of it all stepped away and moved into their own narrative or whatever, and were recorded in the course of the journey. There's really a thing that happened when we got the whalebone back to Hebrides, and the weather was turning really very much at that point. It seemed like we might not be able to get away, and I discovered that really the answer to the whole book was up there, because the buildings and health came completely together. The idea in places like Paris was that if a member of the family got ill, then what you did was you just left the house and moved to another house and left it as it was, because the illness was in the house. And so there were huge numbers of small abandoned crofts and cottages, and people seemed to be more comfortable living in old buses and tin shacks and sheds. And there was the residue of the clearances as well, the Highland clearances, and the time that people like Lord Leverhulme created massive estates and cleared people off their land on the good side of the island and moved them all onto the rough side of the island. And so essentially that island, which I'd never thought of in this way, was about housing. It's about abandonment of housing. And I came across one person who represented the whole story I was telling, which was kind of a vagrant wanderer who walked around the islands all through the year. And in the winter, he found a very good public toilet in the middle of nowhere, where he was able to ram his stick into the hot air blower that you dry your hands with, and it provided a kind of very nice, warm environment from which to sleep in the winter. And strangely, this same character crossed over with Andrew Cotting, the filmmaker who was with me. But when he was making his famous film Gallivant, where he goes around the whole country, he ended up in Skye, which had the most sort of the prize-winning, proud public toilets in the whole of Britain. And this guy, it's such a clean place that people used to come in especially to see it, and he had postcards from all over the world. But once a week, this guy, the character from the Hebrides, would come over, have a complete wash and change in this immaculate place, go and get some money, and then go take off back to the island. So there's two stories sort of cross over, and the book works in that way, as John knows.
Yeah, sorry, I was so absorbed in listening. You mentioned there, Ian, about your early writing around the East End, working as a parks gardener, and then making those alignments and writing about it in some of your early works in that territory. And that popularised, well, that later became known as a certain type of psychogeography, a term that you're largely responsible for popularising, no ducking that one. And that, so a lot of people then associate, when you go psychogeography, they go, what do you mean? You mean like pentagrams in the ground and ley lines and stuff? And they all sort of roll their eyes. But in some ways, is this book, and something that occurs to me, particularly those first chapters, the second chapter, the chapter around Bloomsbury, is this book more actually closer to kind of classical psychogeography, the Debordian idea of psychogeography, of the effects of the built environment, whether intended or not, upon the human psyche? A lot of this feels as if it's actually very much in line with that very literal psychogeography.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's probably true. I hadn't thought about it, and I never really thought much about psychogeography. When when I was doing the gardening stuff and thinking about alignments between buildings and patterns of energy, it was emanating out of the 60s stuff of John Michel and Alfred Watkins's Old Straight Track, and reading quite a lot of prehistory, and also reading a lot of William Blake, and seeing the sense that the city was alive. It was an animate place. It was full of flowing energies, and I just felt that we needed to learn to take that sort of panoramic view of things, and then one thing links with another, and there were patterns and walks you could do. That was one of the ways that opened up looking at the East End. And so writing in that way, what happened was that people like Stuart Home, sort of prankstery figures who were also versed in classical psychogeography, formed the London Psychogeographical Association in the 80s, in the sort of period when I was doing Downriver, satirizing the political energies, and used this stuff I'd been doing, incorporated it into classic psychogeography to make a kind of new and satiric London form. You know, they were all about going up on top of Greenwich Hill and sacrificing Prince Charles, or fascist councillors down in Limehouse would have a line of energy, negative energy running through their houses. All those things started to happen. Then by the 90s, it all became kind of touristed. You know, essentially it became gentrified and branded, as always happens with any kind of interesting ideas. So that I've stepped back from it, but as you just said there, being challenged from outside to go and consider the built environment and the way it works did lead back into what was more the purer form of the 1960s theorists.
It's interesting because there's a couple of chapters in the book back to back. There's a really wonderful segue where you talk about the Golden Lane estate, you know, the Barbican, and their recent kind of fight for light. And then there's the story of Louis Pettit, and it was, you paint a picture of the city of London as this kind of dystopia of pollution, whereas of course those estates of Barbican and Golden Lane were, and also around you've got Stafford Cripps House and all those other in that vicinity, that locale. The London Borough of Finsbury was almost a model municipal socialist government.
It was just what you say. I mean, the whole Golden Lane estate, which preceded the Barbican, was this kind of utopian attempt that grew out of the rubble of the war, but wasn't, and very definitely wasn't, intended to be a sort of garden city thing. It was urban, and the Golden Lane estate in itself was quite drawn from the ideas of Corbusier, but had this notion that it would provide somewhere to live for people who worked in the city, not meaning the people in the financial industries or the bankers or anything else, but the electricians and the carpenters and the actual workers in the city before this had nowhere to live in the city. There wasn't that kind of property. So they built this estate generally for couples. And inevitably, again, when the right to buy came in, a lot of the original people sold up their flats, and gradually this environment became mixed between kind of professionals and people who wanted to live in an urban place, but a place that was a community, and a lot of the original inhabitants. And there was a little park nearby where the two groups met. And what was tragic was that suddenly they decided to demolish Bernard Morgan House, which was a police station house, which was also used by nurses to stay so that they could be close to Bart's Hospital, and take this down and put up one of those enormous generic developments that was going to be bought by people who were living elsewhere as in sort of an investment. And the dust and theft of light was incredible, so that gradually visibly the health of some of the people living in the building began to break down. But it wasn't always a cause and effect. It was something more complicated. There was some kind of anticipation in the health of the people there. And I talk about a particular couple, Emma Matthews, who's a very fine film editor, and her son Louis, who developed this terrible series of epileptic seizures, which went kind of in conjunction with the theft of light and their worry about that. But also with Emma, it was to do with a world where you're spending your whole life staring at the screen and kind of readjusting reality, tiny, tiny details. She was so intense as a film editor. She could be there sort of 12 hours. So in a way, you know, like my back or migraines or whatever, they all come out of that, and then the city can't absorb it because the city itself was pressure.
And I think it's really, what worked brilliantly in the book was the way that you transition from Golden Lane Estate and Barbican and kind of housing developments generally, and you talked a lot about social housing estates and how a lot of that was inspired by Le Corbusier. And then you then go to Marseille to visit Jonathan Meades, who lives in this Corbusier building.
Yes, I mean it was really interesting to me to then go to the original, you know, the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, and see elements of Golden Lane Estate and indeed Marine Court, where I found a flat in St Leonards-on-Sea, which is a building built to look like a boat, the Queen Mary in the 1930s, but has been allowed to kind of collapse and decay in ways that the one in Marseille never has. And yet here again, the health thing is not as obvious as it seems, because Jonathan Meades, who has written very pertinently about architecture over the years, decided he was going to live there, and he no sooner moved in than there was a terrible fire. But unlike what happened here, because this is a high-spec building, everything done in it has been absolutely top quality. 3 or 4 flats were burnt out, and yet nobody was killed, nobody was seriously injured. The thing was brought under control. Everything, you know, about it was that could be contained, and you see that as an example of what can be done. It's not the buildings themselves. And then, no sooner had he been allowed to move back into the building than he suffered serious heart trouble, and immediately started to have a series of major operations. So, you know, you can't kind of predict and create situations always where health is good, but you can certainly build up an environment where when these things happen, they can be dealt with better. So it's a very, very complex book in a way, and the original book that I wrote was about twice the size of this one. They said, you know, I didn't tell me when I delivered it. They said, well, actually, all our books are the same size. I said, oh, okay. I'll take it away then. No. So we kind of came to a compromise that I cut out a lot of stuff, which I probably will use elsewhere as time goes on. But it was, you know, it was that experience, and it's the kind of idea that you take a commission. It's a Faustian bargain, you know, that somebody is going to pay for your book, and it's nicely on display alongside the exhibition, but it's not really your book.
I mean, this takes me on a little bit of a tangent, I can't resist asking. You've been in this business probably longer than anyone I've had the opportunity to talk to about it, writing books and publishing books. Not the business of sitting in tap rooms longer. Why would you be writing books otherwise? But it's changed a lot, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, totally. So the last book I did was called The Last London. It was a kind of idea that particular version of London could no longer be written about in the way that I had done it for so many years. And up to that point, the ways that I did things adapted according to circumstances. You know, you mentioned the 1960s and filming with Allen Ginsberg on Primrose Hill, and it was I mean, really going back to that, it's astonishing that I just arrived in London from Dublin, where I'd been a student, and someone said, "Well, you got any ideas for a film?" And I said, "Yes, there's this thing going on at the Roundhouse, Dialectics of Liberation, and Ginsberg and R.D. Laing and Paul Goodman, all these people there. You make a film about that." And they said, okay, and German TV, you know, so provided the cash to do that. So at 23 or something, I was, you know, had to go and knock on Ginsberg's door and ask him if he wanted to make a film. And you could do it, and the sense of the openness of London as a city at that time was amazing. And sitting up on top of Primrose Hill with Ginsberg while he recited epic poems about the paranoia of TV and politics, and looking down across the spread of London, and then being recalled to Blakean visions when he started to talk about Crab Robinson, talking about Blake seeing the spiritual sun on top of Primrose Hill, you realise the kind of density and levels and layers of London. and it was possible to be making those films, to be meeting all those people very easily, and they being very open to having the kind of conversation that John and I are having now, which has really meant to me that in the rest of my life I felt a strong obligation, if any strange kids turned up on the doorstep, to let them in and let them carry on whatever interviews or conversations they wanted, because that was how it started for me, and that was the sense of London. But the reality of London only emerged with years of doing jobs in Truman's Brewery in Brick Lane, and as a gardener in Limehouse, and seeing what the people who worked there for good really felt, and how the city really worked from the bottom up. And then writing books that would have to have some sort of reportage of the life, as well as the kind of free-form poetic and the inspiration that came from American writers and filmmakers like Stan Brakhage. So the only way to get those published was to do it yourself. So I started obviously a small press myself, which again was very interesting in that the bookshops were there to support it. There were events like this all the time in places like Indica Bookshop and Better Books on Charing Cross Road, and finally Compendium in Camden Town, where you could go there and you'd have William Burroughs, Cathy Acker, Robin Cook, all these kind of people would be turning up, and there was a real exchange between America, Europe and England, London. And that kind of writing sat with that period. And then of course we went into the kind of dark night of Thatcherism, and I didn't publish any books for about 7 years, because I was working as a book dealer, running around the country, running around Europe in fact, buying books and selling them in Camden Passage on a market stall. And that again was equally interesting, because there's nobody madder than book customers. I used to call them outpatients. These strange characters would emerge. They would stand and you couldn't get away because you're at a store, there's nowhere to go. And they would talk to you for hours and hours and hours about one book. But as a result of that, I actually learned something. I developed a whole canon of literature which I would never have known about, and submerged London writers, the writers of the East End, or people like Alexander Barron and Emmanuel Litvinov, and all of those that became very important to me, and who I even met later on. So after that gap, then suddenly literary fiction in the late mid-80s to late 80s was quite alive and interesting, and Peter Ackroyd had written this book Hawksmoor, which was kind of loosely connected with elements of ideas that I'd been messing about with some years before in Ludheath, and I thought, well, this looks like a good gimmick. So I shifted into fiction, and again, fiction was really a good tool at that time. You could do the things that we're talking about and have that freedom. And so Downriver, the book that John mentions there, which I've inscribed and done all the stuff in, was really the only way I could think to deal with what was happening with that period of opening up the docks being converted into Canary Wharf, all the old rule books being torn up, the landscape being completely remade, lent itself to a sort of extravagant fiction, a kind of baroque fiction, in which the character of Margaret Thatcher appears as this person, the widow, who's like a kind of fascistic emanation overlooking London in a kind of Blakean sense. And so that was good fun for a few years, and then they realised these things didn't sell, and so they didn't want me to do fiction anymore. But now once you sold yourself to the publishers, you have to kind of go with where it is. And so I stumbled more or less by accident into what appeared to be non-fiction, though often it had strong fiction elements, of exploring London and then its fringes, which was good, very good, up to the millennium point with London Orbital, which was probably my most successful book in terms of sales, which was a pretty crazy project of walking around the M25 motorway for a year and reporting on the landscape. But what was nice, it was that it led both into the past and into the future, and it was also a really good journey, and so many people joined me at different times. And that's when I really began to realise that the story was the people who walked with you. That you set that up, you kind of invite people along, and then it becomes almost like a novel, because you've got characters to bounce the story off. They see things you don't see. I mean, people like Bill Drummond, you know, who is a great kind of cultural figure, comes along for a walk, and I find he's a real natural history buff. He's spotting plants and animals up the River Lee, which I have never seen, and you get all that. Someone like Robert McFarlane just climbs up trees and picks up weeds, and so, you know, my book of knowledge expands on the people you walk with, until we kind of arrive with John, and there's a kind of crossover between this kind of writing and filmmaking. And I've never met anybody in all of this like John, who is capable of actually following one of these journeys as it happens, kind of scampering along, and making a film, and making a kind of coherent report on a journey that's happening at its own pace. When I was filming with Chris Pettit, who I collaborated with quite a bit, particularly on the M25 project, I was walking with a painter, and by the time Chris had sort of set up this aesthetically pleasing shot, you know, obviously we were a mile and a half ahead, so it was an impossible thing. The way we handled that was that we just split it, and I filmed the walking side of it, and he got in a car and felt happy again, just drove around non-stop for about 48 hours. But John has been the crossover point of being able to do the equivalent of the book while it happens, and have the conversation and cover the ground, and then probably sneak back later and get the shots that give it that kind of added thing. So I think we're in a new. That's the point when you reach the last London, because when it can be done that way, and when it goes up as whatever it is on YouTube, or it can be some, then the writing has got to change. You know, there's a new kind of writing, and I don't think I can do that, which is why I'm doing books like this instead.
Wow, that makes me feel slightly responsible for books. Yeah, I feel about that. Process that.
You did the books as well.
Yeah, I know. It was incredible times. Does that possibly then lead you back to poetics? You're a poet.
Well, I mean, that's been there all along. You know, everybody was, you know, theoretically, just about everybody I knew thought they were a poet at the beginning, and then it got harder, you know, times got tough, and I've never backed off from that. The heart of it is that kind of conceit of the intensity of the language, the rhythms of language, the importance of keeping the thing moving, all that I learned from the American poetic of Black Mountain School, and the actual publishing of poetry, as far as I was concerned, after the late 1970s, was sort of a secret activity. I never stopped doing it, but in the 90s I just put out little desktop books, because I could do it completely on my own terms, and just gave them away, and then later did things through numerous small presses, because I enjoyed that collaboration. But those books hardly ever surface, you know, other than kind of occasionally book catalogues and places, because that wasn't really what it was about. And I'm still doing it now. I've just finished something which is kind of roughly as substantial as Suicide Bridge, or one of those ones I did. But I mean, nobody will ever see it. It just kind of creeps out. I did some and gave them away last week, and that's it. Maybe we'll do a little edition of some kind at some point, but you know, that's there. That never changes. But I don't feel it. I want to get involved with editors and publishers and promotion in that area, because that sort of is the core of it in many ways. But it doesn't need to be seen.
In terms of your process, Iain, which the thing of filming with you as well is, you've always been a fan of your books, but then also seeing you in the zone, in situ, it's even more beguiling and fascinating. And you made a comment when we made the little video for one chapter of the book, that was the effect that you re-walk the paths trodden by other people, and then make a record of retracing of other people's journeys.
I keep coming back to it, but I started with the credo I had at the very beginning of it all in Blood Heat was from W.B. Yeats, from his book A Vision, and it was that the living can assist the imagination of the dead. And I thought that was amazing. And this is it, that it's a city populated by these ghosts, walking with ghosts again. That you can't move across London. There are the obvious Dickens-like figures who walked enormously. And recently I've been very engaged with what was happening in 1873. That in London, at that moment, when London was at its most confident as a kind of imperial city, and the railways and the underground and phones, all of the aspects of modernity were there. And in the city arrived Van Gogh and Rambo at the same time. And Van Gogh is working in Covent Garden in an art dealer's, and he's lodging in Brixton, Stockwell, and he walks in every day a particular route over the Westminster Bridge, and later when he's had various setbacks, he's working in Ramsgate, and he walks to Canterbury, and then he walks from Canterbury to London, he stays in Lewisham, and he walks to Welling. All in a huge splurge. And so when you see these paintings of boots, he knows what a boot is. And at the same time, Rambo is here with Verlaine, and he's undertaking huge walks down the river, and he's writing these prose poems, incredibly intense, using elements of the vision of London at the same time as Van Gogh is. And Van Gogh's at the beginning of his career. He never does a painting in London at that stage. He hasn't got the confidence. He does lots of sketching of the buildings he lives in and the churches. He preaches a sermon which is about walking, and he doesn't even think of painting. So the visionary paintings come right at the end of the line, whereas with Rambo, this is the moment. The poet sees the city, engages the city, is overwhelmed by it, and stops writing by the time he's 20 odd, and never writes again, and disappears into Africa. So their careers are mirror images. But asked to write about the Van Gogh in London period for the Tape, etc. magazine, it only kind of came into focus for me when I started actually physically to re-walk where he'd walked, and to realise how epic some of these journeys were, and to begin to see some of the things, some of the buildings, some of the things that he'd seen. And this is a sort of major example, but go onto any street, just walk from here to Forest Gate, and it's full of echoes. I don't feel that anything I've done has ever been more than to listen to the sort of the voices of the previous, the people who haven't quite finished what they wanted to do and have left traces that we pick up on and we regenerate. And equally, then there are aspects of the future. There are things coming in, there are little clues as to the way it's going to go. And I think in something like Downriver, where I was letting rip in a kind of very free-form, satiric way, some of the stuff in there now has turned out to be kind of completely accurate, even underwritten. The horrors that were coming up in the same way that in 1979 the film The Long Good Friday has stuff where they're wandering through the whole Dockland wilderness, and they say one day they'll be having the Olympics. and sailing, Bob Hoskins sailing under Tower Bridge, sort of trying to make an alliance with the mafia, and saying we're going to bring gambling into London. This is going to be the city. Those kind of great speeches all emerged from Barry Keefe, who was a journalist in Stratford and knew the territory. It was all from listening to what was going on and creating a picture of what was coming.
I know we've talked about this before, but it's always fascinating the way that you've managed to somehow find the story which tells you a lot about that period of London. Like you mentioned there with Downriver, but then also then with like South of the Territory, a similar thing there, where you get the kind of the corrupt tail end of that Tory reign from the 80s into the 90s. That comes out brilliantly in like South of the Territory. And then with London Orbital, that's almost the classic book about well, London Orbital actually and Edge of the Orison, very much stories of Blair's London, Blair's Britain. With London Orbital obviously, but then with the Millennium Dome, but then with Middle England and the whole John Prescott flying over Middle of England in a helicopter, pointing out places where he's going to build new towns, and you cover that terrain there. And on and on. London Overground is a very prescient book as well, and Ghost Milk and others. You always seem to find that. How do you do that? So I can do
it. You've got to be bored enough to spend a lot of your time walking. just being out there and discovering a form really of following your instincts. For a time, I always used to walk out towards the Lee, living in Hackney, to the Lee Valley and up there and sort of away to the east was a kind of romantic zone where you could tap into the industries of the second industrial revolution and also see the remnants of wild orchards and travellers' camps and the incredible manor garden allotments which people had reclaimed this land and built huts and made a community. All that was sort of swept away. But for a long time, that was where I haunted and where I picked up on traces of these stories. And then I just wanted to go away from that entirely. I didn't want to go there for a period. And I just stumbled onto the Overground Railway, which had just come and which actually seemed to work and which posited a new kind of London, the London of all of these businesses that would take over under the railway arches. That you'd no longer be doing dodgy MOTs, you'd have bars where people come and listen to writers bang on. And you'd have gyms and you'd have people selling fish for £1,000 a pop. All that stuff was coming, and you could see it. But you could see that London was a city, in part, that would be based around a railway, that the particular kinds of flats would be right on it, the right kind of coffee bars would be there, and it would be, instead of spreading out to the edge as it had been, it would just be a sort of donut around the middle. So I was very interested in that. But it was a very easy series of conclusions. But once you start doing one of those things, you can't predict the end story. You can't predict what it's going to throw up. And really what that one threw up was the drama at the end when Andrew Cotting, a filmmaker who'd been walking with me, was returning from this back to his house in St Leonard's, and he's hit on the Old Kent Road, side banged by a van on his motorbike, and really nearly bleeds out. His life is in danger, and he's taken into a hospital. And then that whole drama is like he dipped into a black hole. He said he didn't know what had happened for about 3 days. It was all dreams and nightmares and strange visions of London from the stuff we've been talking about. And that sort of became the atmosphere of the book, which couldn't, of course, have been predicted in any way. And then to exorcise that, we walked the same circuit of the Overground that we'd done in a day. We walked it through the night. And then London at night was such a different thing. That was wonderful. I mean, I really relished that, because I don't think I'd done it in that way before. Most of my walking was early in the day through to the evening. And this started in the early evening, and John actually was there for the first part of that. And you could feel the sleep of London, the dream of London rippling around this railway territory. And suddenly finding ourselves down at the Thames was completely magical. You just stopped and sat down on a bench in front of the church where William and Catherine Blake were married. And eventually passed through the hospital where Andrew had been taken after his drama, and walked right through this building in the night and emerged the other side as the light was coming up. And so all those things, the thing is, it's an endless project. I think that's the thing that you ask, how does it, well, once you've begun to accumulate all this stuff, there's no getting out of it until you develop sufficiently crippling back thing not to be able to move. And up until that point, you move and you get the story. London is a story. London is a flow. And the great thing about London is the river is a tidal river. It's a world river. The whole Conradian thing of being on the tide, the stories of the Congo, the Heart of Darkness, can be got out of the Thames when you're waiting at Gravesend for the Thames to change. Or a whale can turn up in Gravesend. Or Pocahontas can go ashore and die because she doesn't doesn't want to go back to America, can't go back to the forest, dies in London, becomes part of the London myth. You know, the same place is the same thing all the time, and all of it coming out of the river. The river is the great life force of this city.
Your collaboration and your kind of partnership with Andrew Cotting is fascinating in a way. It's wonderful. I remember when I was working at the National Film Theatre and they were screening. There was an announcement of screening a film. It was a late announcement in the programme. A film called Offshore Gallivant, and it was the first time I think you'd collaborated with Andrew, wasn't it? Where Andrew made a film, and if you don't know Andrew Cotting's work, I highly recommend you go and discover it. Particularly, start with Gallivant, his first feature, and then work your way forward to his films with Iain, and they're incredible visionary films. And but at the time, sort of Andrew, in a way, along with Patrick Keeler. So when people talk about psychogeography, they would have probably mentioned a combination of 4 names. Really, it would have been yourself first. There was Will Self, who at the time had a column in the Independent called Psychogeography, and Patrick Keeler, obviously, because of the films London and Robinson in Space at that point, and Andrew Cotting because of Gallivant. And then when I saw that you were working together on Offshore Gallivant, I remember at the time saying to Jeff Andrew, as the head of programming, I was like, my God, that's the psychogeographer's dream ticket, hoping they would use that in the publicity. They didn't. Because there were probably only like 10 people who were psychogeographers, but to anybody that was the mass of people that are interested in all of that, that was almost a bewildering, dizzying combination of you and Andrew together. But then also, you're quite different characters in a way, aren't you? Because Andrew's a force of nature, isn't he? He's a great big man bear, and he's a if he was at the back of the room now, everyone would know he was here. A beautiful presence, right? And you're possibly marginally more refined. I don't know if that's the correct word or not. I don't know, but spending time with it, it's a beautiful relationship. But it's not just a beautiful personal relationship. It produces fantastic work. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Right, how you met, how you got to start working with it, and why you continue? Because you're making the Whalebone Boxes with another film, right?
Well, what happened was Sight and Sound way back was really quite an interesting thing, and there was this period with Patrick Keeler and Andrew Cotting emerged publicly at the same time, roughly, with London and Gallivant. And I got to review both of those things for Sight and Sound, and I was deeply impressed by both. The Patrick Keeler London was much closer in a sense to what I was doing with Lights Out for the Territory and things. It was a kind of series of theoretical journeys across London, and he teased out this wonderful voice, very funny, which Paul Schofield was voicing from a series of static images of London. But Andrew Cotting was completely kinetic and kind of crazed and leaping on and off fans and breaking his leg and throwing himself into the sea. But his journey was based around on the edge of England, was with his daughter Eden, who has Joubert syndrome, and his old granny Gladys, who didn't know each other very well. And the combination of those two in this van was very, very striking. So I wrote very enthusiastically about that. And Andrew Cotting has a hut up in the Pyrenees, and so he wasn't seeing the papers or anything. But someone had sent him a savage review of Gallivant in, I don't know, probably the Daily Mail. It said whoever gave public funds to this should be hanged, drawn and quartered, and he was deeply depressed. And then someone sent him Sight and Sound with this big praise from me, saying how wonderful it was, and he was very chuffed. And so we met at down on the south coast at an exhibition by a man called Snelling, who does swims around the coast and photographs the shore. And so we got chatting, and we went off and did a couple of walks together, and found we got on well. And Andrew then was going to swim the Channel with his family. And he said, would you come along and sort of document it and write a piece about it? So I said, well, yeah, of course. I mean, wonderful, crazy, anything could happen. This sort of completely Melvillian voyage was in prospect. Because the Cotting brothers are quite a troupe. I mean, he's only one of them. The rest is quite something. And there was also Xavier, who's an actor who's been in all of his 3 films, feature films, the last of which, Lek and the Dogs, has just been done, Filthy Earth and Ivor. And so this whole bunch got on this boat, and I just saw it was complete ship of fools, desperate voyage. And it's like they hadn't got out of the harbour when the guy in charge of the boat said if Andrew was swimming, and you have to have a light stick sort of attached to your rear, which looks quite strange, like you've got some green tail. He's going along, this man says, if he's the best you've got, we're turning back. And then the tide was against them, and every time they got onto the boat they threw up, because coming out of one element into the other. And there was piles of food that he brought, and I was the only one eating, so I don't get seasick. So here we are. And there was no footage to speak of, because the guy who was going to do the camera was so throwing up so much before he got out of Dover Harbour. He was under a tarpaulin, and I was trying to wrestle the camera from him just to get some shots, but I couldn't get it.
Isn't that Ben Rivers, isn't it? Notable passes.
I won't say who it was. And then Andrew got a few shots himself, and I always thought he can't make a film out of this. So anyway, he did. One of the things about him, he's a terrific assembler of footage, an archive in bits. And he brought Eden in, and then he got me just to free-form riff, and he said, I'm going to use that along with the film. So I thought, fine, go ahead. And it worked quite nicely. And then I was doing Hackney Rose Red Empire book, and as I said, I was bringing different people in to walk with me, like Will Self and Robert McFarlane. And I thought with Andrew, he'd be ideal to swim around Hackney. So I said, look, you can swim around. I've worked it out. You're coming on the canal here. And he said, wait a minute. I may be crazy. I'm not that crazy. So he came with me. We walked around the water, and he looked at it. And then we finished the day's walk up around a reservoir where suddenly we were completely surrounded by swans. And he thought, well, wait a minute. We could go to Hastings and get a swan peddler, and we'll take that to London. We'll go through the sea, and then we'll go through rivers, and that'd be quite interesting. I said, yeah, great. I said, I want to go to the Olympic side. Fine, let's do a kind of a double treble marathon on the swan. And so that, in the way of Andrew, that became a film, and that was our first sort of major collaboration. And for me, it was a terrific holiday. It was in October, a couple of weeks on a swan, drifting through the English countryside. Lovely. And seeing how he worked, which was completely to do with just doing it and then reverse engineering it later. He's a kind of master of the soundtrack and multiple layering and clever use of archive. And if nothing's happening, he'll create a disaster. So he jumped off the swan, and he's wearing all this sound kit that's worth about $2,000, and he just goes down. The sound man goes white, this is absolute disaster. But whatever it is, he's on the cusp of sort of performance, on the cusp of just incredible energy. And just as John was saying earlier, you start to move in those ways, the stories appear. When he made film Dead Dad about his father, in which he took an inflated version of his father, Blow Up, and his grandfather around the world to various places associated with them filming, he got up to the Faroe Islands and discovered that his grandfather had a whole other family up there that nobody knew about. From wartime, he'd spawned this second family who got together with the Cottings in this amazing landscape, and that whole story was waiting for him. And now, last week, when I saw him, he discovered another grandfather in the 1930s had cut his wife's throat. He was a military regimental sergeant major, had been in the Boer War and the First War, had some brain damage and become incredibly strange, murdered his wife and nearly killed his children, spent his life in Bedlam. Well, most people would be kind of a little awestruck and slightly horrified, but Andrew kind of pounced on this. This is the next chapter, this is the story. These things are there. They're just out there waiting for you when you move in the right direction.
I'm going to link it back to the book, Ian, actually. There was a thing that really struck me. And it's a quote from Jonathan Meades. Do people know Jonathan Meades? He used to make TV programs. That's terrible.
He still does.
He still does make TV programs. Sorry, that's productive and awful. But Jonathan Meades is another interesting character, because he almost has his own genre of television program, which nobody else is allowed to do. And it's incredible. There's probably about 3 people in television that can have that similar degree of freedom, and he's revered in television, absolutely revered, and obviously outside it as well. And he said, it's from the book, we are controlled by buildings, Reed said. The majority of them are curtailments, they are monolithic. Provisional jails. Places are, on the other hand, heterogeneous and I can't even pronounce that, that's Jonathan Mead's bit, multipartite. Places are feasts for the spirit. That was a really interesting summary of what you capture in the book.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. That's really, Jonathan's very, very pertinent about that. And I think the final extension of this kind of writing was to put himself in this building and to see how those buildings, which we've seen in kind of debased forms, create such bad lives. When it's done properly, carefully, you use very high specification stuff all over it, and you have a roof. You have a wonderful roof that's open to all, with a little school on it, and a proper walk around, and you have that whole landscape. So the building's in the landscape, the building has elements of a boat, the building has a sort of a pride in itself, and it really works. And the Jonathan Mead's kind of thesis seemed to be embedded in something like that, and now he actually lives in it as well. And one of his better films, which I hadn't thought about till I started to write about it, was in the Hebrides. It's a kind of Isle of Rust, it's called. It's worth checking out because he got very excited by the sort of aesthetics of decay up there, the way that everything is kind of rotting away, and the old houses and huts are just disappearing into the landscape. Because that landscape is the oldest rocks, the sort of million-year-old rocks. And it is also the landscape Stanley Kubrick used in 2001 to create the Mars and the red planet. The ultimate alien thing was just flying low over Harris with a red filter.
Sorry, I really came across the other day the person who the recce for that and actually shot that footage is a notable director. He directed The Cement Garden. Anyone know Andrew
Birkin?
Andrew Birkin. Yeah, Andrew Birkin recce'd that.
Right.
And apparently the helicopter pilot wanted to get him sacked because he said he was reckless. He was totally reckless, and in the end he filmed it all. He filmed a lot of the aerial footage himself.
It's a good place to be reckless. There's nowhere where there are more reckless drivers than up there, and most used to be completely pissed. So the other thing, apart from the ruined houses, was ruined cars. They were everywhere. and Jonathan Mead does quite a good turn on that. It starts off as a kind of vicious assault on Scottish tourism and sort of Cod's Highlandism, and then goes into this landscape which he finds fantastic. And indeed, he became a friend of Steve Dilworth, the sculptor I mentioned, because they both like food.
So we're going to screen a clip from the film we made, and then do you want to read a little bit first? I was going to suggest that. Yeah, great.
Okay. Since we're going to screen John's film which is about the Pepys estate in Deptford, and I start by kind of querying the name, the Pepys estate, because the person who lived there is the other diarist of the same period, John Evelyn. John Evelyn had an estate, Sayes Court, which is right alongside the Pepys estate. Pepys's connection was that he worked in the naval office and he visited the naval dockyards and marshalling yards that were there, but he was a visitor, and Evelyn had a kind of quieter and more engaged sense of the actual territory and did a lot of planting, so we'll come to that. But the Pepys estate was a 1960s estate, and it's very interesting, as pretty much as soon as it was done, John Benjamin was making a TV or fronting a TV documentary about buildings, and it was all shot by helicopter. And the sort of final passage is the new tower blocks going up on the Pepys estate, and he is saying how horrific this is. People can't live in these kind of buildings. You can't, the horrors of high-rise flats. So he was doing a kind of Ballardian number ahead of the time. And the Pepys estate then did sort of seriously decay, and the weird thing was that Andrew Cotting, who had mentioned, lived on it. At the time they were hard to let flats. He got one of these flats, and it was sort of the highlight of his life. He keeps referring back to it. But despite everything being bad all round, when his daughter Eden was born with this Joubert syndrome, which is really a hard one, the estate and the people on it gave fantastic support. All the medical facilities he needed were nearby, and the kind of energies of this place just overwhelmed him. So essentially it didn't matter too much that the fabric was difficult and rotting. I mean, maybe this suited sort of artists who were coming in more than people who had been living there all along, but nevertheless, it was the place that was his place. So with John, I went back down there to look around this estate and to walk along the river towards Sayes Court, where John Evelyn had been. And the one tower that's on the river front, called Aragon Tower, has been revamped. It's privatised. It was sold off, and it's been turned into, because it has the river view, it's been now turned into expensive luxury flats and penthouses and all the rest of it, with the remnant of the estate still behind it. So this doesn't come into the film, this bit, I don't think, but I'll read a little bit about Aragon Tower. We came at last to the river, to Aragon Tower. Could we have arrived by accident at a lighthouse dedicated to the Surrealists, a thrusting psychogeographical memorial to the poet Louis Aragon, author of Paris Peasant, an influential work of urban drifting? Merlin Cavalier, his guide to psychogeography, published in 2006, claims that Paris Peasant introduces an element of political protest that first recognizes the future role of the urban wanderer, as the detached observer is forced to face up to the destruction of the city and to engage in struggles against it. Aragon Tower is its homonym, Arrogance Tower. 29 floors, blue sky mosaic with pyramidal steps to the distant summit. The tower is residential, privately owned, and has 14 penthouse units. It's been described inevitably as the catalyst for the regeneration of the Deptford riverbank. Sculptural heads in the English tradition of disemboweled traitors or pirates chained and left on the tide before being decapitated have been displayed around the river-facing base of the tower. They're protected behind a locked gate, so that the Thames Path casuals have no chance of reading the plaque identifying the faces, the ones framed as a wall of ancestors. The sculptor responsible is Martin Bond, a local man and a former classical pianist and an illegal immigrant. Bond made the crossing from Mexico into the USA to play with a punk band in Baltimore. The last man left standing in Aragon Tower was Les Brooks. He traded as Pocket the Juggling Clown, a children's entertainer. Les, who lived in the tower for 20 years, was alone at the end while he waited for the inevitable expulsion. He patrolled the deserted corridors on his unicycle, like a child from The Shining, grown old and feral. Manky Deptford pigeons fluttered in and out of a broken window. The council, growing impatient, cut off heat and water, but the clown had taken advantage of Thatcher's right to buy scheme. He believed that his property he had purchased was his to sell at a time of his own choosing, but he was the wrong demographic. He was a stilt walker with the tallest stilts in London, and an audience of drill-wielding hard hats staring at him. The TV set in the last flat is dead. The cables are sliced. But hustling crews are turning up here to feature his story. The deal was already done and dusted. Lewisham Council trousered 10 million from Berkeley Homes, the pitch being that their new money would inevitably bring coffee outlets and big windowed gyms into the area, as indeed it has, if not for the benefit of the locally decanted. The expensive facilities are for incomers, thirsty lycra cyclists and joggers. At the finish, the solitary clown acknowledged that he'd made a killing. He picked up 180,000 in a flat he'd bought for 50,000, and which would now trade for around $500,000. In the lifestyle TV series shot in the relaunched Aragon Tower, champagne corks are popping. Innocent investors have no idea where they really are. Like Betjeman, they just swoon over the view, and it's all theirs. They own the whole wide sky. Communities will naturally integrate, say the planners. The view collectors will drink to that. The new lift works. The building is secure, and the masks on the exterior wall are giving nothing away.